Hello, welcome to COM 222 Intercultural Communications. Today we're going to be talking about the dominant culture in the United States and the disabled culture in the United States. So, to begin, let's talk about the idea of a co-culture. In the late 1960s, people began to see the large number of co-cultures that were spread throughout the United States. There are millions of people who held a type of membership in their particular co-culture while also being part of the dominant mainstream culture. For example, you can be a white man, that is the dominant culture in the United States, who is also disabled, and that's a subculture. Despite there being a quote-unquote dominant culture, the United States is a pluralistic, multicultural society with minority groups representing over a third of the total population. Co-cultures often have many of the defining characteristics found in any culture. A specialized language system, in other words, the slang, shared values, a collective worldview, recognizable communication patterns, and a common history. Members of a co-culture usually share a number of other similar characteristics, such as religion, economic status, ethnic background, age, gender, sexual preference. Many people living in the United States hold multiple co-cultural memberships. So, for example, a gay African American man would be considered a member of two different co-cultures. And over there on GQ magazine is Michael Sam, who was a breakout football player in college, and he did get a pro team, but he wasn't that good when in the pros. But more importantly, he was also gay, and he was out about it. A Russian woman who emigrated to the United States and marries a man who emigrated from India would also be a member of multiple co-cultures. So a Russian woman who's married to someone from Asia who, is in a new country. These are all things that give you part of the culture that you identify with. These diverse co-cultures bring their experiences and ways of interacting to an intercultural encounter. Their distinctive communicative patterns may be confusing to outsiders. For example, a Vietnamese American with strong extended family ties may feel it important to ask to be excused from work to help celebrate his uncle's birthday. But a Euro-American who are more focused on the nuclear family of mom, dad, and grandma, grandpa, and the kids, that very linear sensibility, would find that request inappropriate. Insufficient information about these co-cultures can produce stereotypes and prejudices. This often leads to incorrect and damaging assumptions about people from various and sundry co-cultures. We must understand the unique experiences of these co-culture members, which will help overcome many communication problems. So what we're looking at here is how cultures intersect when somebody has membership in a variety of co-cultures or subcultures. Sitaram and Kajal in 1976 identified intracultural communication as the type of communication that takes place between members of the same dominant culture, but with slightly differing value. They go on to explain that there are groups or subcultures within the dominant group who hold a minimal number of values that differ from the mainstream as well as from other subgroups. These differences are not sufficient to identify them as separate cultures, but diverse enough to set them apart from each other and the culture at large. Communication between members of such subcultures is intracultural communication. Sarbaugh sees intercultural communication as an indicator of the degree of cultural experience shared, or not shared, by two people. The more culturally similar the participants, the greater the level of intraculturalness surrounding the act of communicating. So, look at these pictures. We have up on the top right, we have a picture of 4 guys, various races, all with Eagles, Philadelphia Eagles shirts on. Some of them have their faces painted, but they all have that culture of Eagles football. And if you're not from Philadelphia, trust me, there's an entire culture built up around being an Eagles fan. Below that is a hairdressing salon for black women. And again, any black woman who has ever been to a salon like this knows exactly that there is a subculture that goes on within there. So before we move forward, I want to talk about the concept of a social contract. A social contract is an unspoken agreement among the members of a society to cooperate for social benefits. For example, we give up certain things such as speeding or going around killing people in order for the government to provide security and infrastructure. Thomas Hobbes, a philosopher from the first half of the 1600s, helped develop this concept in terms of this reason. Men are natural, and when we say men, he means women too, but it was the 1600s. Men are naturally self-interested, yet they are rational. They will choose to submit to the authority of a sovereign in order to be able to live in a civil society which is conducive to their own interests. We sacrifice certain acts in order to maximize individual society's success, which must also align with our individual success. If we don't benefit, we will replace or overthrow the authority in charge. So again, what you see here is this idea that we have a unwritten norm that in this country, in the United States, and in many, many other countries, we will give up certain freedoms in order to maintain our best possible way of life. So we pay tax, and that pays for our roads and a variety of other things like our defense system, which is the largest in the world. Now, in other countries, for example, Sweden, they pay a lot of tax. They can pay up to 60% of their income as tax. However, they have the best healthcare in the world. They have some of the best education in the world. And as you go through their system, what you see is society in Sweden has sacrificed a lot of the money they make in order to make sure that society as a whole benefits as well as them benefiting individually. Culture daily tells us and shows us how to be in this universe, and it informs future generations how to be. From the moment we begin life in this world, we are instructed in the cultural ways that govern and hold together our society, ways that ensure its survival. So really the social contract is something that has been around since man was able to get a small tribe together to cooperate and share the labor for the entire tribe. It is also something that begins the moment we're born, and we don't really have a choice in this. So for example, when we are born, our parents label us, our name, John, Tamika, Jose, Mary, and then our genders are determined at once, and we are accordingly swaddled in our appropriate colors and treated in appropriate ways. So girls get the pink, boys get the blue, and then as they grow up, they get certain toys. Girls get dolls, boys get trucks. And we are reinforcing to them not just these ideas of gender or the role men and women play, but the entire social contract. You have to extrapolate it out. Everything we do, the socialization process is there to help us internalize the rules of appropriate and inappropriate societal behavior. For years and years, everybody knows that you should not cheat when you play a game because that's not fair. But the reality is that there is a mass number of people who have decided that cheating is allowed, and as such it becomes appropriate for them, and they are outside of society's social contract. And theoretically many of those folks end up in jail. Of course, a lot of them end up as CEOs. So there you go. Society is maintained through and indoctrination in the ways of culture. But the question is, whose culture is actually being passed on? Whose social order is being maintained? And whose beliefs and values are deemed appropriate? Whose norms, mores, and folkways are standard society? In other words, who decides who gets to make the rules? In most societies, as we know them, there is a hierarchy of status and power. Not everyone abides by the social contract, and violence often prevails, as conquered, colonized, and enslaved people know far too well. The social contract whereby some people become slaves and others become the masters does not equate, because it does not benefit the individuals who are slaves at all. So that's a violation of the social contract. On the other hand, if you are someone who is wealthy and needs employees, paying them a livable wage is inherently part of that social contract of, I'm going to make your life as enjoyable as I can by paying you a wage that I can afford and you can live on. Whatever the basis for determining the hierarchy, society assures the evolution and continued presence of a power elite, those at the top of the social hierarchy who accrue and possess what society deems valuable or vital. And what that means is, you don't have to have all the money in the world to be at the top of the heap. In various countries, when you have authoritarian leaders, that power is so much more important than the money they have. And they usually have a lot of money because they've stolen it from their people. But more importantly, what we see here is this idea that power can be a more desirable trait than just mere money. In turn, the presence of a power elite ensures the asymmetrical relationship among the members of its society. In fact, power is often defined as the ability to get others to do what you want and the resources to force them to do your bidding if they resist. The asymmetrical relationship in its extreme form. And that's where you have, your authoritarian perspective, where the prison guards have the ability to do to prisoners oftentimes physical punishment, emotional punishment, psychological punishment, because they've violated that social contract and they're outside of it now. So there's this asymmetry of they have nothing left for them to bargain for. The preservation of the power elite through violence and force is not the most effective or efficient way of maintaining one's position at the top of the hierarchy. We can look at the Soviet Union, which was led by a dictator, and then another dictator, and then another dictator. But eventually the people said, look, we're not benefiting at all. And they wholeheartedly rejected the system until politicians realized that they needed to get on board this popular thought process, or they were going to get swept out with the rest of the Soviet hardliners. It's the same thing in any other country that has democratic elections. You're going to have a group of people who are supportive of the power and a group of people who are not supportive of the power. And the people, when they get together, they can decide to vote out the current power. And again, the idea here is that the underclass, the working class, the working poor, the lower middle class, and the middle class have some opportunity to find their own identity and find their own place in the world that will benefit them. The powerful in many societies, our own included, go to great lengths to maintain their positions of power and what these positions bring them. As the culture reflects implicitly or expressly the needs and desires of the power elite becomes a vehicle for propaganda. Cultural aspects that govern such matters as social organization and behavior, beliefs, values, and the like can often be seen as rules and institutions that sustain the few at the expense of the many. When we talk about the concept of dominant culture, what we are really talking about is power. Those who dominate culture are those who have the most persistent and far-reaching impact on culture, on what we think, what we say, on what we believe, and what we do in our society. A dominant culture, therefore, significantly reflects the principles of those who have the political and economic power. Now, on the right here are some thought processes of various countries and how they are represented as being basically prostituting themselves to multinational corporations to draw money and more economic resources to these countries. So you have the multinational corporation represented by the three men in the middle. You have Mexico, which says, I'll let you degrade my environment. And of course, in the guise of a sex worker. And again, what it comes down to is, what do some countries have to trade in or to sell? Their own natural resources, their environmental stuff like trees. China, again, another sex worker. I'm cheap and only 13. Not just cheap, but we know the Chinese have very poor working conditions, and yet, there's no conditions on the people who live in China and work in China to treat their employees any better by American companies, because we want to keep those prices cheap. Finally, the sex worker on the bottom, USA, she says, I'll do anything. Please, I need the work. And that's how so many of our government officials get elected, is because, they promise jobs. Not necessarily good jobs, but they promise jobs. So again, we're always looking at how we as a country can gain more power economically and politically. So let's talk about non-dominant groups. Non-dominant groups are those who have not historically had ongoing access or influence upon the dominant culture's social, political, legal, economic, and or religious structures and institutions. Non-dominant groups include people of color, women, gay people, the physically challenged, the aged, just to name the most prominent. The expression non-dominant is used to characterize these people because we are referring to power and not population numbers. So if you looked at the population numbers, you would say, well, aren't women 51% of the population? Well, yes, but historically, they have not had the economic, legal, or political power that has been dominant in the United States. Non-dominant people are also those who, in varying degrees and various ways, have been invisible within society, and at the same time bear a visible mark of being outside the dominant culture. Your race, your age, your gender, you can be, a man, you can be a white man, but you could be a gay white man. And that picture over there on the right is from a gay pride parade, and you'll see the white guys looking just like normal old white guys, except they're in their very cute pink shorts. But more importantly, it is a mark of identity that is often consciously or habitually assigned low or negative status by members of the dominant culture. So these plain old white guys over here looking cute in their pink shorts, put on a suit and tie, give them a briefcase, suddenly they're now part of the dominant society. But at home, they're coming home to their husband, not a wife with, all of the trappings. So the dimensions of invisibility and marked visibility are keen indicators of the status hierarchy in a given society. So in a given society, the expectation is that you are heterosexual. So a lot of people hide. And then there's other things like age. Women know that as they get older, they are seen much differently than when they were in their 20s or 30s. So consequently, they will lie about their age. They will spend thousands of dollars on plastic surgery, makeup, and various and sundry spa treatments to try and make themselves look younger. And then when you get into race, you're dealing with some of the similar issues of people trying to lighten their skin or do their makeup so that it doesn't appear that they have the quote-unquote Asian eye. So the problem with having this hierarchy is that it dehumanizes non-dominant people. When non-dominant groups intersect and interact with the dominant culture membership, i.e. the power elite, they are often felt like they've been relegated to this object status. Expressions such as, "they all look alike to me," or "if you put a bag over their head, it doesn't matter who you have sex with," attest to this level of invisibility and dehumanization of non-dominant peoples, such as people of color or women. Indeed, one need only look at the dominant culture slang repertoire for a single non-dominant group, i.e. women, to see the extent of this object status. And here are just some of the less perverted ones: tail, piece of ass, side of beef, hole, cougar, kitty, and so on. One of the important dimensions of any caste system is that it is hereditary. You are born into a given social group and you are usually marked for life as a member. The United States also judges class structure, role prescription, and expectations surrounding social groups. When we talk of lower, middle, and upper classes in this country, we are not usually talking about birth and origin, but about power and control over material resources and the attendant wealth, privilege, and high status. Class, then, is intimately bound up with matters of hierarchy. It is no accident of nature that many of the non-dominant peoples in this country are also poor people. Nor is it surprising that the non-dominant groups have been historically the unpaid, low-paid, or enslaved workforce for the economic power elite. So let's take a moment and look at the concept of role prescriptions. Role prescriptions are linked to both matters of status and expectations in terms of one's perceived status, class, and case. A role can be defined simply as a set of behaviors. We hold certain behavioral expectations for certain roles. We only notice how culture-bound and prescriptive these roles are when someone is perceived to behave inappropriately or outside of their prescribed role. For example, the mother who gives up custody of her children in order to pursue a career. She has stepped out of line. When you think of a husband and wife splitting up, you almost always expect that it's either the mother getting custody or they split custody. Rarely do you think of
the wife giving up custody to her husband, and it's just something that's outside the realm of society's expectations. It doesn't mean it's wrong, doesn't mean it's right, it's what society has deemed right or wrong. It is more accurate to talk about those who dominate a culture rather than the dominant culture per se. So we need to look at how society is dominated by that power elite. So, geopolitics, the USA, and the dominant society. The US is not merely a country with certain designated boundaries. It is also a geopolitical configuration, which basically means that our international relations are influenced by geographical factors. The USA is a country whose history reflects the relationship of geography, politics, economics, and the domination and control of people. It is no accident that the doctrine of manifest destiny, and if you're having a flashback to 10th grade history class, that's where they usually talk about it, the doctrine states that the United States was destined by God to expand its dominion and spread democracy and capitalism across the entire North American continent. So this manifest destiny, this mindset from the American power elite that it is their responsibility to spread democracy. The U.S. power elite really just wanted more land, because this manifest destiny just happened to correspond with a time of rapid growth and the development of industrialization in the United States. It created that rationalization of manifest destiny to validate why they were doing this. Another example of a dominant culture's ethnocentrism, which is the belief in the inherent superiority of one's own ethnic group or culture, being on full display is the missionary-like work carried on by its members, whether it be to civilize the natives, that is, to impose the conqueror's culture on them, to educate them in the ways of the white man, or to Americanize them. And that's essentially what we all did during the 1800s when the Indian Wars were taking place and we were removing Indians from their historical land and moving them onto reservations. We took away their religions, we took away their languages, we took away their rituals, and the desire was to Americanize them because the perspective was that being an American is much better than being an Indian. So, the dominant society believes that it knows best. Identifying ourselves as Americans and our geopolitical entity as America in light of the peoples who live in the north and south of our borders speaks to economic dominance in this hemisphere and our own ethnocentrism. So if you look down here at the map on the left, this is North America. So you're going to see that, much like in Oreo, the United States is between Canada and Mexico. And yet, we call ourselves Americans, but we do not call Canadians or Mexicans Americans because we feel that they are foreigners, even though we're all from the same continent. So again, it comes down to this idea of how you want to name yourself, label yourself, identifying yourself. Identifying the United States in geopolitical terms is as a conqueror and controller of other people. And this suggests both the probability of non-dominant groups of people within that territory and a hostile relationship between these groups and those who dominate culture. Indeed, many of the non-dominant people in this country today are the very same ones who the powerful have historically colonized, enslaved, disenfranchised, dispossessed, discounted, and regulated to poverty and low-class status. So the asymmetrical relationship between the conqueror and the conquered continues uninterrupted. Although the form of oppression may change through time, the fact of oppression of the non-dominant remains. And it comes down to this idea of what are the rules and are they applied fairly? Well, if you are a white man in this country, you will say, here are the rules and I think they are applied very fairly. Well, if you're coming from an African American experience or the black experience, you're going to say, the rules are always changing and I am treated unfairly no matter what the rules are. You know, you get out of your car, you allow yourself to be searched, they still shoot you. The problems lie in the fact of what the dominant culture approves and disapproves of. So, we're going to move on to talking about communication and persons with disabilities. The passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, otherwise known as the ADA, is a Bill of Rights for people with disabilities, highlighted the fact that there are now a large, vocal, and dynamic group within the United States. People with disabilities constitute a large segment of the American population that has increased over the years. Estimates of how many people in the United States have disabilities that run as high as 1 in 5, or about 20% of the population. Everything from, being in a wheelchair, not being able to walk, using assisted listening devices, being blind, having issues with your hearing but not being completely deaf. There's all kinds of disabilities that exist. So there are two reasons for increases in the number of persons with disabilities. First, as American population ages and has a longer life expectancy, keeping in mind that in 1900 the average life expectancy was in the mid-40s. Now it's in the late 70s. So you'll see that there was a 30-year improvement over the last 120 years of people on Earth in the United States. So as they get older, they will live long enough to develop disabilities that can be related to age. So for example, an older woman, she gets to a certain point and she needs to use a cane. And then a few more years may go by and she may end up in a wheelchair. There are various and sundry issues that are accompanying age. A lot of people have eye problems. They develop cataracts. They develop glaucoma. So all of these things have a definition in a disability. Advances in medical technologies now allow persons with disabilities to survive life-threatening illnesses and injuries where survival was not possible in earlier times. In the past, most people with disabilities were sheltered and many spent their lives at home or living in institutions. And today they are very much a part of the American mainstream. So, in 50, 60 years ago, if somebody was in a wheelchair, they didn't work. Now, as long as the building that they work in is handicap accessible, they can sit and work on a computer all day and have absolutely no difference in how they do their work than somebody who can walk out of the building. Another element that we see with subcultures, and especially subcultures where there is a shared feeling of being just disliked by society, they use what's called coded speech, or slang in some ways. People with disabilities use a distinctive speech code that implies specific models of personhood, society, and strategic action that differ from those of non-disabled people. The distinctive verbal and nonverbal communication used by people with disabilities creates a sense of cultural identity that constitutes a unique social reality. Several researchers have described the communication of disabled and non-disabled persons as intercultural communication. That is, we recognize that people with disabilities develop certain unique communicative characteristics that are not shared by the majority of non-disabled individuals. The onset of a physical disability requires learning new ways of thinking and talking about oneself, and developing new ways of communicating with others. For example, people in wheelchairs can refer to people who are able to walk as bipeds. There is a great documentary called Murder Ball, and it's basically a rugby team in wheelchairs, and these guys have all kinds of inappropriate slang for each other, and as such, it really does define that there is a subculture of people, even within the disabled community, who want to beat the crap out of each other playing with a ball. So let's discuss the difference between a disability and a handicap. Even though people tend to use these terms interchangeably, their meanings are very different. The two terms imply a different relationship between persons with disabilities and society. The term disability describes those limitations that a person can overcome or compensate for by some other means. Crew and Athelston identify 5 key life functions that may be affected by a disability. Mobility, in other words, how you move. Can you walk? Do you have a fake leg? Employment. Can you be employed? Self-care. Do you need help being taken care of? Your social relationships and how you communicate. Many individuals are able to compensate for physical challenges associated with the first 3 key life functions through assistive devices, for example, using a wheelchair or cane or hand controls to drive a car, through training, usually physical therapy or training on how to take care of one's personal needs, through the occupational therapy to find suitable employment. A disability becomes a handicap when the physical or social environment interacts with it to impede a person in some aspect of his or her life. For example, a disabled individual with paraplegia can function well in the physical environment using a wheelchair, ramps, and curb cuts, but he or she is handicapped when buildings and/or public transportation are not accessible to wheelchair users. So the next time the bus has to load somebody in a handicap or in a wheelchair, do not roll your eyes or groan. It is how they survive. When a society is willing or able to create adaptations, people with disabilities are able to lead increasingly independent lives, which is very important to their self-esteem and health. And let's go back to this idea of the social contract. Someone who has the adaptations of being able to get into a building, work a job, and live an independent life is going to actually cost the government less because they're not getting government benefits, they're not living on food stamps or anything like that, and more importantly, they're paying taxes, which is what keeps the government going. So when you think of a social contract, you're thinking of that idea of the government mandates these adaptations in order to make these people not just more independent, but also not a quote-unquote burden to society, and they can contribute. So again, we see this example of the social contract and how it develops and improves a person's ability to move forward in their lives. It is important to realize that the practical and technological accommodations that are made to adapt the physical environment for people with disabilities and useful for non-disabled people as well. Most of us are unaware of just how handicapped we would be without these physical adaptations. For example, when a student is walking with a heavy load of books, automatic doors open. Ramps, curb cuts, elevators, and larger doorways become important environmental adaptations that anyone can use and appreciate. Physical limitations become handicaps for all of us when the physical environment cannot be adapted to meet our shortcomings. You hurt your ankle, you sprain it. Going upstairs, you can do it, but it hurts and it takes a long time. That elevator is there not because you want to be lazy, but because it is adapted to provide assistance to anyone who wants to do business with this particular store you're in. It is often less difficult to detect and correct physical barriers than it is to deal with the insidiousness of social barriers people with disabilities face. Coleman and DiPaolo labeled these social barriers as psychological disabling, which is common in Western culture where much value is placed on physical bodies and physical attractiveness. When people with disabilities begin relationships with non-disabled people, the challenges associated with forming any new relationships are often greater. Non-disabled persons may be uncertain about what to say or how to act. As a result, non-disabled persons may feel overly self-controlled and rigid because they feel uncomfortable and uncertain. Often, a person with good intentions acts in a way that is unacceptable to those with disabilities by unknowingly acting offensively or patronizing disabled people with unwanted sympathy. There's a TV show on in the United States called Mom, and the titular mom is dating a man who is in a wheelchair. He's a stuntman who broke his back and is in a wheelchair, so he's still very manly. But she had borrowed his vehicle and used his handicapped banner or sticker thing to park in a handicapped spot. And when he found out, he was really angry. And it's a great episode for those of you who may have access to it, because it really does emphasize how, social barriers of not understanding what it's like can impact this sense of I am as independent as I can be, but the fact that you're taking advantage of my independence by utilizing it so you can park really close to the store just kind of negates any feeling of being able to say you own your life. High levels of uncertainty can negatively affect interaction and relationship development between people. It becomes easier to avoid that person rather than deal with not knowing what to do or say. When non-disabled persons make the effort to overcome discomfort and stereotypes to interact with people from the disabled culture, they often find themselves with conflicting expectations. On the one hand, Americans are taught to help the handicapped. At the same time, Americans conceptualize persons as individuals who have rights and make their own choices, and are taught to treat all people equally. However, when non-disabled persons encounter a person with a disability, this model of personhood creates a real dilemma. In the end, it may simply seem easier to avoid situations in which you might have to interact with a disabled person, rather than face feelings of discomfort and uncertainty. And this is how many people react to communicating with people from other cultures as well. However, avoidance is not a very good solution in the end, especially if this person is to be a member of your work group or family, for example. So again, when we are dealing with people that we perceive as, independent, do we want to offer them assistance? Should we offer them assistance? How do we handle this? Will they be insulted? And it really comes down to overthinking the situation. You can ask, not ask. It's like the old story of the Boy Scout helping the old lady across the street. This is this idea of them doing things as supposed to make society a better place. Most researchers who study communication and the disabled have studied non-disabled persons' reactions to disabled others. A second related problem is that many researchers talk about people with disabilities and not with them. People with disabilities have rarely been represented in survey data. Third, and most significant, the research has most often taken the perspective of the non-disabled person. That is, researchers tend to focus on what people with disabilities should do to make the non-disabled person feel more comfortable. Although there have been more research from the perspective of disabled participants in recent years, there are still far too empirical studies, and we are left with a very incomplete picture of the communication of people who are disabled. So this is from a charity, and it's sponsored by a mathematics publication, and it said studies show that 70% of young people with disabilities can get jobs and careers when they are given the right placement and support, such as school to work, transition training like Project Search, and Bridges to Work. So somebody who is in a wheelchair, somebody who is deaf, someone who has missing a limb, these folks can work, no problem. It's just a matter of finding the right spot for them. An intercultural perspective on communication and disability culture leads us to suggest the following practical tips. This is all the don'ts. Don't avoid communicating with people who are disabled simply because you are uncomfortable or unsure. Don't assume that people with disabilities cannot speak for themselves or do things for themselves. Don't force your help on people with disabilities. Don't use terms such as handicapped, physically challenged, crippled, victim, and the like, unless requested to do so by the person with the disability. And assume that a disability defines who a person is. And that, again, is a big don't. Don't assume that this disability is who the person is. A lot of people end up in wheelchairs after a motorcycle accident. This might have been some badass guy with muscles and a mustache and leather, and now he's in a wheelchair. Don't assume that he is, this little pussycat now. He's probably still a big tough guy. He's just a big tough guy on wheels as opposed to in a motorcycle crew. And again, another television show that features somebody in a wheelchair is the show Superstore, and the character Garrett, who is in a wheelchair, they don't really discuss it. When it is brought up, he always kind of makes people feel bad for him so he can gain from them. And he's kind of that mixed character that, he's always kind of shystering people, but he's also a good guy in general. But it's just, it's a great character in terms of a handicapped or a disabled person who is in and of itself, his identity is not necessarily tied exclusively to that wheelchair he's in. And now the do's. These are the most important things, so you really want to remember these. Remember that people with disabilities have experienced others' discomfort before and likely understand how you feel. They may not like it, but they understand. Assume that people with disabilities can do something unless they communicate otherwise. Let people with disabilities tell you if they want something, what they want, and when they want it. If a person with a disability refuses help, don't go ahead and help them anyway. Think of it like when you're at a restaurant or a bar and you're going up to the bar to get another round of drinks, and you ask everyone, hey, anybody want a drink? And 3 out of the 4 people at the table say, I'll do it. 4th person's like, I'm driving, so I have to drink water from now on. Don't assume that he actually wants a drink, because he has his own sense of what he wants to do. Using terms such as people with disabilities rather than disabled people. The goal is to stress the person first before the disability. Treat people with disabilities as persons first. Recognize that you are not dealing with a disabled person, but with a person who has a disability. This means actively seeking the humanity of the person with whom you are speaking and focusing on individual characteristics instead of superficial physical appearance. Without diminishing the significance of a person's physical disability, make a real effort to focus on all the many other aspects of that person as you communicate. Who are they? What would you say to somebody who wasn't in a wheelchair or who wasn't blind? Maybe it is a matter of just being aware that there's certain things they may not be able to do. If somebody's been in a wheelchair their entire life, asking them if they played sports in high school may be a bit insensitive. So, that's it for today. If you have any questions, please feel free to text or email your instructor. Alternatively, feel free to leave a comment and we will respond as quickly as we can. Thank you and have a fabulous